Hello, everybody, and welcome to this week's session of the UX and UI experts. I have a very special guest here, Graham McAllister, who is a design expert from the Google Experts program, and we are extremely excited to hear about his approach to designing for games. And before we uh, get into the talk that you have prepared for us today, why don't you tell us a little bit about, I know that you have a PhD in computer science,
I do.
and
Yeah.
you've been drawn towards the design world through a very specific path, and you were telling me the other day about the appeal of the open-ended challenge with games, and I think that we've all experienced that in one moment or another. So why don't you tell me a little bit about your background?
Yeah, so my undergraduate, I'm from the UK, I'm from Ireland actually. My accent is a bit messed up, but we'll gloss over that. My background is in software engineering, and my PhD was in computer graphics, so very much a technical background, strong CS, low-level programming. And when I finished those programs, I was a programmer for a while in the networks industry, so telecoms. And I wanted something a bit more creative. I could never decide as a kid whether to do something creative and fun, like music, or a bit more nerdy and algorithmic like computer science. I love both. So I ended up, after programming, taking a job in music technology, where my job was to teach music students computer science. So again, it's blending these two worlds. But doing that, all my research was in human-computer interaction, which is what are the barriers to someone enjoying or using a product effectively. So in the field of user experience or usability, as you probably know, it started off, at least commercially, mostly on websites or digital products. And that is an interesting challenge, but it's very much goal-driven. In other words, there's something specific you're meant to be achieving, creating a new account, using a product, washing your clothes, whatever it may be. So there's always a clear goal in mind. And with video games, that's not always the case. It's a bit more difficult because you have this thing about fun as well. So yes, you have barriers around usability. Can someone understand what the designer wants you to do? But somewhere along the journey, you have to have fun doing that. And that is just so much more complicated and interesting than, I don't say normal usability, but usability for websites or things like that. For me at least, they have their own challenges for sure. But when you add in this other thing about fun, everything becomes just an order of magnitude more complex. And the number of questions you start asking are just never ending. Fun comes in all sorts of forms and formats. As you know, when we speak to players, we'll come to that. So fun for each of us has a personal meaning. And our job at Player Research really is to figure out, well, why is someone having fun and somebody else is not having fun? Why is that? Because if you break down the demographics, they're maybe playing the same games to the same age, the same background, but yet when they play this new game, somebody will have fun and somebody will not have fun. Why does that happen?
I think that's a really cool point where you were talking about earlier how you were trying to find the emergence of creativity and logic, and here you're working with logic, which is how many variables are being controlled, how many variables are at play here, and then you have the aspect of fun. Creativity, how do you control the creativity? How do you predict it? How do you know when you're designing the right thing? So that's a very cool intersection.
That's exactly right. And if I was to boil it down to one core question, it's really about testing designers' assumptions. So they assume the player will do certain things. They assume the player will have fun in these ways. And it's rarely the case. So if you were to say, well, what's my job? It's really about taking a scientific approach to testing designers' assumptions about where the fun will come from or what leads to fun. And that never gets boring. It's a never-ending source of enjoyment and open-ended questions. But today I'm going to show you how we try and answer those questions anyway. That's what I'm going to try to do.
Well, yeah, let's not delay any further, and why don't we get directly into the talk that you have prepared for today, and afterwards we'll have some time for Q&A. I'll be accepting questions. I'll try and have the Q&A live on the live stream, but also here in the Hangout. If anybody comes up with a question, definitely write it down and hold it until the end.
Okay, can you guys see my screen, the slides?
Yes.
Yes. Positive? Okay, so I'll just start, Melissa, is that okay?
That's great.
That's great. Okay, so the purpose of this talk really is to give you guys some idea of how we try to make games successful. So what is the scientific process that you can put a game through that increases its chances of players enjoying it at the end? Um, as you know, in the old days, the console days, if anyone remembers those, were those that process of making games. Basically, the idea was you would make a game, and maybe you got someone to play it beforehand, maybe not. And the first time you got user feedback while making a console game like Xbox or PlayStation would be from a user review or a critical review. And that was a very risky strategy. So you're spending multi-million dollars making games, and you're hoping that players would like it once it goes on sale. And most games were not that successful. So the ones you've heard about are the ones that have been successful, but the vast majority of games have either done poorly, never made their money back, or were cancelled long before release. And the whole field of user research is really to say, well, how can we stop that happening? How can we ensure that if someone's making a game, that it'll be successful and will resonate with the player base? So just to give you an idea before we begin, these are some of the companies that the things I'm about to tell you, the whole process, in fact the 10 processes, these are the sorts of companies who are interested in using these methods to improve the quality of their games. The important thing to say here really is that they're a whole mixture. Some of these companies are mobile games, so they're on the Google Play Store, they're on the Apple's App Store or Amazon's. Some are on PC, for example Steam, and some are on Xbox or PlayStation. The platform is relatively independent of the process. So regardless of what sort of game you're making, the process I'm about to show you applies to every platform. There may be some differences towards the end, but we'll come to that. In terms of the app stores, these are some of the games we've worked on for Apple or Google Play. And our track record to date is that every single game we've worked on has made it to the front page of the Apple's App Store on release. As you know, Google Play Store is structured a little bit different. Fewer games are surfaced. But for Apple's at least, every one we've worked on that's been through part of this process or all of it has been featured by Apple in terms of top grossing, editor's choice, new and noteworthy, those sorts of things. I have to be very clear and say it's not just due to us. That is not the case. We're just part of the formula. So we'd like to think we're part of that success. We're contributing, but we're not wholly the reason, of course. So let's start with the most obvious problem, which is most of the work that we do is on mobile. So there are apps for Google Play Store or Apple's App Store. And the number one problem that every mobile developer will talk about will be discoverability. So how can we make sure that when we release our app, that it's going to even be heard about? Never mind making a good game. We'll talk about that in a second. The previous problem, or the first problem, is how do we know that someone's going to hear about our game? Now there's all sorts of factors involved in this that I'm not going to talk about today, such as virality, but I may talk about that in the future. But if we were to boil that down to a simple funnel, here are the processes that game developers go through. They're going to make a game, and they're hoping that at the top of this funnel, that enough players are interested in their game somehow. Now, whether they pay for user acquisition, or they pay for some advertising, or they get featured by Google or Apple, all of those things are possible. But regardless, they are hoping that the game they make is of interest to players. They then hope that of those players who download the game, that enough of them find it interesting. So the player experience layer. You're interested, you've downloaded it, and hopefully they've made a good game. And because most mobile games are free to play, what they're then hoping is that the game they've made is good enough that enough players will then give them money. So this is the basic principle that most mobile developers will go through. The problem, of course, is that I've been very kind in drawing this funnel. The one on the left looks like most players who enter will pay you, and of course that's definitely not true. The funnel is much more like the one on the right-hand side, where there potentially could be lots of players interested in your game. And in fact, there could be a lot of players who even enjoy your game. But the amount of players who will pay you for that experience is much, much, much reduced. So in each layer you go down, you've dropped off significantly in each step. So this is obviously a problem, because to make enough money back from a mobile game, you need a lot of players either to give you a small amount of money, or you need fewer players to give you a reasonable amount of money. And both models could be successful. We have certainly worked on games where they don't have millions of downloads, they address a niche audience, but each member gives them enough money that they're successful. So it's not the case, it doesn't have to be true that you need millions of players. It's one possible approach, but not the only approach. So I mentioned earlier about methods of discovery. How do you get people to the front of your game? Well, the most recent and most popular way for mobile games is you pay people to discover your game, and that's called user acquisition. Apologies if I'm going over the basics, and I'm sure most of you know these things already, but I just want to make sure we're starting on the same foundation. So the most popular way in mobile games at the moment is you will pay people to get to the front of your game. That could be through some form of advertising. So an advert will appear, someone will click on that link, and that will take you either to Google Play Store or to the Apple's App Store, where you can see the front page and you can download the app. And each time someone clicks on that, you have to pay for that service. It's very expensive. Typically around Christmas time in the UK, around December or Thanksgiving in the States, you could be paying up to $10 to get someone to the front of your game. We'll come back to that point in a second. Obviously, word of mouth is much stronger, so marketing may work, but it may not have a strong effect. Word of mouth is very strong. If your friend recommends it, of course, you're much more likely to try it out. Search, or App Store Optimization, ASO, is very important. In other words, what phrase you type in at the top of the Google Play Store, will that find the game you want? Perhaps, perhaps not. And of course, reviews. So all of these things and more, like the virality factor, are contributing to people discovering your game. Also very popular these days is Twitch and YouTube. And some companies are designing their game to be watched on YouTube and Twitch. That's in their design. So then, again, the old way would have been to design a game that was fun to play. Now we've got designers who are designing their game that's fun to watch as well as play, because they know that the Twitch and YouTube audience are very important to their business. So this is what most companies hope will happen. I'm not sure if you can see my cursor, but over here you have user acquisition. We'll pay people to come to the store. You then hope that they enjoy your game, this loop of engagement retention, in the hope that they pay you some money. And what you're hoping, this part at the very bottom, is that the cost of paying for that person is less than the money they give you back. So maybe I pay $5 to market to someone to try my game. Maybe I'm hoping to make back $6 from that person. The problem is in most games it doesn't happen. It's not true. Most games are paying for users and they do not make enough money back. So what happens is they'll run out of money and the company will close eventually. And this is what we're trying to deal with today. So let's take a quick look at player research. We have a 4-layer model that we talk about. At the very top is monetization. In other words, the companies want to make sure that the player pays. And by the way, the player should feel happy paying. It's not a negative thing. They should want to pay because you're getting more of a good experience. But the problem is these 3 layers beneath it are in the way. So this is like a hierarchy. And the problem is for most games, the problem is down here. So yes, the company wants to make money. They will only do that if the game is good. Now, nobody would disagree with that. You make good games and people are more likely to pay you. You cannot guarantee it, but it's more likely. So what does a good game mean? Now, we could talk all day about that, but I'll keep it very simple. The layer beneath the player experience for us is usability, which means can the player actually do the things that the designer wants? But there's a layer beneath that. Does the player actually understand the things that they have to do? So if you don't understand something, this lowest layer, chances are you won't be able to do it. If you can't do it, usability, then you're probably not going to enjoy it, player experience. And if you don't enjoy it, well, you're almost certainly not going to give someone money. So although most companies say things like, oh, we made a good game that didn't make money, when we look at those games, that's almost always not true. they almost always have problems relating to the very lowest layer. The players are really confused about their game. They cannot achieve basic principles. And these things combined are contributing to the problems up here. If there are any psychologists watching, you may be familiar with this model. It's called the model of accident causation, or the Swiss cheese model. But basically, when an accident happens, such as planes crash, helicopters go down, cars crash, that sort of thing, this model helps to pinpoint the layer where the problem occurred. So the problem in video games is that you're not making enough money. And the easiest reaction is to say, well, we didn't make enough money, so our business model was wrong. Well, it's easy to say that because it's the last layer. It's closest to the problem. But the problem is each of your layers, so understanding, usability, player experience, monetization, they're all flawed. And sometimes the flaws line up. So a problem with understanding causes a problem with usability, which causes a problem with the experience, which means they don't pay. So although you see the effect up here, this is my problem, the cause of the problem almost always starts at a lower layer. And that's a knock-on effect. So at Player Research, what we're trying to do for games companies that we work with is to tell them, yes, you do have a problem up here, but the underlying cause of your problem is in fact at a much lower level. So you're trying to separate out the cause, and then you can fix the cause, and then prove later on that it's been resolved. If, for example, you're in any doubt that the game industry doesn't have a problem, this is an analysis of 100 video games that we did. So a publisher commissioned us to analyze 100 video games. And across the top, you can see these 100 games, and they're anonymized. I can't tell you what they are. And down the side, we have assessed each of the 100 games according to 9 variables, 9 metrics that all video games have in common. And there are things like, for example, user interface, controls, feedback. There are things that all games have in common. And so we rated each of these 100 games across these 9 metrics. In fact, there was a 10th metric, but for now we'll say 9. If that metric, let's take this one as an example, the one with the black outline, you can see that it's got some green dots. That means for that metric, for example, feedback, it could be good, but it's got some red ones too. That could be tutorial, for example, or onboarding. And what we're saying is, in this case, the tutorial for the game is very bad. So bad, in fact, that players are very likely to leave and never come back. Yellow is in the middle. It means it could be improved. And it's very likely that a lot of players would leave because that component of the game is not successfully implemented. And the one stat that we shared with the company, the publisher, was that 73% of all the games they made in this list contained at least one red issue somewhere on the user journey. So the user journey is the vertical path here. And you can see in this case that nearly every variable is red. Red, 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 red. They did one thing good and then red. And this, as it happens, was the most expensive game. This was the highest the game with the highest production values, and it was significantly, yeah, could have been better. Could have been better, let's say that. So all of these developers, these are all different developers, by the way, but they've got a publisher in common, are all professional game developers. These are not students out of university making their first game and making rookie mistakes. They're all professional game developers who have done it many times before. And nearly every single game is making fundamental mistakes to the gameplay. So we know this happens all the time in video games. So if I just put those figures back onto the model I showed earlier, how many games are not making enough money? Well, it's hard to say financially, but according to that last model, 3/4 of them are at least making fundamental mistakes that should not be there. There are things that could have been avoided, but they weren't. So it's a significant problem. The problem is not enough players are making it through the lower layers of your game, the understanding and usability, and getting to the place that developers want. Having a good time with the player experience, retention, playing for long periods of time, and then paying them. So what do you do about this? I'm going to speed up a little bit. What do you do to fix these sorts of issues? So in the second half of this talk, I'm just going to show you everything that we do at Player Research to help make games as good as they can possibly be. And regardless of the game you're making, albeit, be it mobile or console or PC or Facebook, it doesn't matter. This process is very similar. So you have a concept stage where you come up with the idea. You have a design phase, maybe called prototyping, where you're coming up with the idea and refining it. Then you go into production, where you make the game. And then for mobile games, you put it in soft launch, which typically means you take one country of the world, such as Denmark or New Zealand or Canada. You take a smaller subset and let them play it. You get feedback, and then you launch it to the rest of the world. So this model is pretty much common across most of the game industry. And what you can see is that in each of these services, we try and give developers feedback at every single stage. In the console world, feedback was happening maybe during the blue phase, production, where you would have run a playtest. But even if you run a playtest during production, look at how much you're missing out on. You have this whole phase back here, concept and design, where maybe you're running on assumptions. I assume this is going to be fun. I think this is going to be fun. But you don't know. And we're trying to remove the uncertainty. That's the whole point of doing this. So in the rest of this talk, I'm going to step you through very briefly, I'll not go into too much detail, each of these phases and show you what we do for the game industry in the hope of delivering polished games. So these are the 10 services down the side, and each of these services polishes one or more layers of our 4-layer model. Let me just explain what that means. So if I take the first one, a concept test is something we do even before you have a design. There's no code, there's no design. All you maybe have is something like, I'm going to make the next Candy Crush or the next Clash of Clans, whatever it may be. So a concept test, if you do one, adds a little bit of polish to all 4 layers. It's not perfect. In fact, none of these are perfect. That's why we have 10 different methods. Because if we could just use one, well, we would just use one. But we can't. So what we try and do instead is add many methods that add polish to the layers from a different perspective each time. Let me show you what a concept test looks like and why it's important. So for mobile games, one of the biggest factors that developers are seeing is that players are downloading their game. So they're going to the store and they're downloading the title. But what they're not doing is maybe even playing the game once. They may never open that app at all, ever. Or some players are opening the app for one session, looking at the game and never coming back. Now this is a massive problem because developers are paying that user for that experience and they are never getting their money back. And these are significant numbers. This is not a minority. These are substantial numbers we're talking about. So the concept test, for example, could either be testing the idea for your game or features, or in some cases what we're seeing is more important, is testing what your game may look like on the App Store. So this is Clumsy Ninja, for example. I'm not sure if you played it, by what is now Zynga or Natural Motion. And they were the first game ever to get a video preview on the Apple's App Store. So what companies are interested in doing now is saying, when players see either the video or the screenshot or the text, what do they think this game does? Because one of the factors which will contribute to players downloading your app but never, or maybe playing it once but never again, is that the description of what you promise players is so different from the actual game that players feel they've been lied to and never come back. I don't want to name any games, but there's one case where there was an action game and they had a video and it looked like players were engaged in a high action combat scenario, I'll say that. And players were very excited by this. They thought, yep, that looks like the sort of game I would play. However, when you download the game, it is in fact a turn-based game where you play cards. So what looked like a real-time action combat game was in fact a very slow-paced, turn-based card game. And in the description of the game, it never said that anywhere at all. Didn't tell the player at all. So players were downloading it, expecting one thing, and then being delivered something else. And that could potentially cost that company lots of money in user acquisition. Many players could potentially download it, but never ever get beyond the first session, which is a significant problem. So that's one thing for concept tests, is just saying, are you going to deliver users the right thing? Perhaps the most successful concept test that we know about is Candy Crush by King. So Candy Crush went through different variations before the version you know today. In fact, one of the early versions was French. And we had a voiceover speaking in a French accent, and the art style was different. And it did not resonate well with players. They did not like it, they did not come back, and the stats were not promising. When they kept the very same game, the same mechanics, but changed it to the candy theme, changed the music, and changed the voiceover, the numbers were significantly better. So this is the same game with a different art style that made what it sold for. Well, King sold for what, 6 billion was it? Recently the deal closed. So a very successful concept test. It is vitally important to your players. Your players may love your game, but it has to also look in the right theme and art style. These are equally as important as the mechanics of the game. They both have to match. This is not just done in mobile games. This is screenshots. I think it's from Destiny. Someone can correct me if I'm wrong. But they're testing the concepts for the characters even before they make them in 3D. So they're bringing in players and going, we're going to make characters that look like this. What do you think this gun does? What do you think this character would do? How would they move? And if the player says, oh, I think that gun is powerful or used from a long range, and if that's not true, they can change that because it's concept art. It's really quick. But if you've already made that in 3D or made it into the game, that's very expensive to change. So these companies are testing the concept art before they take the idea further into production. I'll go through these quite quickly because there is 10 of them, but I just want to give you an idea that we're trying to polish gameplay at every single stage. A competitor analysis, excuse me, again, is long before you've made your own game. What you're trying to do is learn from user experience features from previous games. So if you're making a new match 3, why is Candy Crush so good? What's so good? What about Jelly Splash? Why are people playing these games but not some other match 3? Again, you can get learnings from each of the 4 layers in this case. Competitor analysis is usually what we do in-house. We don't bring in real players in this case. It's our staff. They're all got backgrounds in either psychology or human-computer interaction. And we're applying principles of game design or either your mindset, so maybe psychological principles or human-computer interaction principles to assess competitors' games. For example, these are called heuristics. And you can see here's an example of some heuristics that you could apply. Some of them are usability related, and some are gameplay related or user experience related. And you could apply these to your competitors' games. How is their introduction, or their goals, or their metagame in case of mobile, or replay value, or social? And you can rate each of them accordingly and get some rough measure of, okay, where are the strengths and weaknesses of our competitors? Many companies do a competitor analysis, but when we ask for them, what we see is that they typically do it on a feature comparison. What features are they doing? That's not what we're interested in, especially. It's how the feature has been implemented. So it's the layer beneath the feature. Okay, you've got the feature. It's not a tick box exercise. But how has this feature been achieved? What are the best practices? As an example, these are 4 base builder games. You may or may not recognize them. And we spent 1 year analyzing these 4 games. So you have Clash of Clans, Boom Beach, Game of War Far Age, and Star Wars Commander. They all look pretty similar. They all do similar things, but some of them are a lot more successful. In the case of Star Wars, the one at the lower right, it had an amazing IP to build on. And even with the Star Wars IP, it can still not compete with the other games. Why is that? Why isn't it number 1? That's what we tried to figure out too. So just to give you an idea of how much detail can be extracted, sorry, my machine is pausing. 2 seconds. Is everyone still there, by the way?
Yep, we're still here.
I'm getting a spinning beach ball on my Mac, which I know is not a good sign. So, this is not good, Melissa. Apologies.
No, that's quite all right.
Are you still looking?
I thought that I had prayed to the demo gods, but apparently not hard enough.
My fingers are crossed. But are you still looking at the base builder slide, by the way?
I am currently looking at the
4 games.
I see the 4 games.
Okay, I cannot move. I'm frozen solid. Okay, I'm going to quit it. Apologies.
That's all right.
Can you still see my screen?
Yes.
Okay. I may want to cut this out at some point. We'll see. I can't believe that froze. I'm very disappointed. Anyway.
I think that this has been an incredible talk so far. So if anybody has any questions that they've been thinking about,
Yeah, please jump in.
Yep, definitely. You can ask questions now, or um, you can start preparing your questions for the end. But I think that this is a really unique opportunity because designing for games there's so many layers to it, and a lot of what you're talking about. And I think that he just dropped off for just a second, but he'll be back. A lot of what he was talking about in terms of making sure that you dive a little bit deeper, that's what we've been working towards through design sprints, making sure that we're going deeper than just the Band-Aid solution. We want to actually find the cause. So doing things like asking 5 whys and making sure that you're getting involved in product design before the last minute where they say, you know, make it pretty. All of these are just ringing so true. So it's really cool to see where they overlap and then also see where the added complexity comes into play. And Graham, we see you coming back. Ishay, I see that question, so I'll make sure that that gets asked. We can't hear you. No. So Ishay just asked the question to elaborate on the accident model and some of the things that you asked beforehand. So we'll make sure that that gets asked. But we're just waiting to have Graham join right back in. Does anybody who has joined the Hangout, who is here and can have audio, how many of you develop games?
I do.
Do you have any questions or comments, remarks about the process that you've experienced?
So far, I think everything's pretty clear. But and I had a few questions, but Graham answered them already. So no questions so far.
But how about your experience as a game developer in terms of getting users and creating a product and knowing that you're creating something that is going to be fun for users? How do you think through some of those challenges?
Well, in my experience, I haven't been able to do a lot of in-person playtesting. So most of the time, I have to rely on analytics data. So it's interesting to know what you can do when you have access to that, when you have the resources to actually have real players play the game beforehand, before you release it. Yeah, I think it's probably the best way to go.
Yeah, it certainly is a little bit more affordable, right? And Graham, I see that you're sharing your screen. Analytics are interesting, and Graham says analytics are interesting. We can talk about that in a little bit.
No.
I just heard something.
Am I back?
You're back.
Oh, okay. I think maybe not to blame it on PowerPoint, but it was running in the background and causing problems. Okay, I shall move on briefly. So you can see the base builder thing again, base builder screen.
Yes.
Okay. So in terms of, I heard the analytics question, so I'll come back to that briefly. But if you want to know how much detail you can extract from even the first hour of gameplay, We spent about 1 year on and off, not full time, looking at base builders, 4 games for the first hour, and we wrote a 255-page book on the user experience of 4 leading games, those 4 games. It is an enormous amount of detail to try and understand why is one game more successful than another, and what techniques are they using to keep the user engaged, make it easy to understand, and bring them back. Obviously, it's too much for this talk, but you get the idea. Oh no, the beach ball's back. I can't believe it.
And he's gone. That time it happened very quickly. We don't have the title of the book, but I'll make sure that we get that, because that sounds like something that would be very, very useful. We had a question from the panel here. Do we know the title of the book? So for the other folks who are dialed into the Hangout, what was your interest in coming and joining this talk, and why does designing for games something that intrigues you? I know I personally was considering the I was considering the constraints that we have and how we can apply material design to most e-commerce apps or some web-based apps, and when we're moving towards the game industry, that all of the constraints and all of the yes and no sort of clear what is the best solution starts to become very, very fuzzy. And so it was very fascinating to hear from Graham, and that's why I definitely wanted to make sure to schedule a call with him, because I think that this design challenge is extremely large and fascinating.
Okay, I think I'm back again.
Welcome back.
Thank you for putting up with this. So let's try one more time. I will not go full screen this time, just in case. So
okay.
So yeah, we're trying again. Thanks for reiterating that, Melissa. We're really trying to understand which methods can be used to test the design process at every stage. And we've got as far as the competitor analysis, but not from a features point of view, but really a UX point of view. I'll move quickly over interaction analysis, but it's specifically on controls. And this is highly important for touchscreen devices. Just very briefly, this is a mobile game called Battle Squadron, and the company made 4 possible design control schemes. And they were certain that the one in lower left, the tilt-based control scheme, they were adamant that this would be the best possible method. And they also built 2 other methods. But we managed to convince them through interaction analysis. I'll show you a brief slide in a second. That there was a 4th control scheme that, in fact, would fix all their problems. And if you download this game today, Battle Squadron, this is the control scheme they now defaulted to. But their original design idea was to go with this scheme in the lower left, which is one of the worst possible control schemes for the game. But they really enjoyed it, but it was amazingly frustrating. But it wasn't until we showed them evidence, and it was this sort of evidence, that explained to them why it was a problem. Said, well, if you want to use this control scheme, that's fine, but we're going to show you where all the problems will come from and why users will be frustrated with your game. And I don't have time to describe this, but if you email me, I'll send you the whole document on what we did. It basically breaks it down to exactly what happens when your thumb touches the screen on virtual control scheme for mobile games. If, for example, when you touch the screen, you leave the controls on the screen, different things will happen than if you take them off. And one way is better than another. And this document that we sent to the company explained why that was and why they would have more success and a better player experience if they do it a certain way. So interaction analysis is very important. It's very fine detailed. You're talking about individual taps on the screen that really pulls apart the game designer's design. Collaborative design, as you know, is us turning up on site or working with the designers. So it's a combination of game designers and user experience professionals working together to critique their design before it gets into code, before it goes into final art stage. And what you can see, for example, is that the collaborative design adds polish to the usability and understanding layer. Just as an example, this is a game called War for the Overworld. The chap on the right in the green t-shirt is the lead designer of that game. It was a very successful Kickstarter game. And this is our two guys on the left. This is Seb, who's an HCI, interaction design background. This is Ben, who's got a psychology background. And we're testing Josh's designs, even though they're only on paper. So he brought in his design before the game was made and said, this is what we're thinking of making. Can you guys see anything wrong with this? And we spent 2 days just pulling their design apart. And there's a case study online where you will see what Josh thought as a result of the process. We're now moving into expert evaluation, which is a bit like using heuristics, if you like. So again, the guidelines I talked about earlier, this is us assessing people's games before we put it in front of real players. So you want to make sure you catch as many issues as possible before putting your game in front of a real player. The reason is, if your game contains basic usability flaws and you ask someone to play your game, and then either ask them directly if they like the game or things like that, or if you ask them to fill in a survey, they may say things like, this game sucks, I don't like it. There could be something, it could be a usability issue causing them to say that. What you're trying to sort out is, are usability issues causing frustration among the players, or is it a game design bad? Players genuinely like it. The purpose of expert evaluation for us to catch any usability issues before we put it for real players. So real players, someone was asking about analytics and playtesting. Probably the most commonly known user research. If players are not family or friends, they're not designers, they're not people in your office, they're people who have no.
Graham, the audio's cutting out just a little bit. Do you think you could maybe adjust the bandwidth?
I don't know what I can do. Is it still breaking?
If you hover up at the top of your screen, a bar will appear and you can click on a scale that looks sort of like a volume control.
Oh, is that
and you
under...
can sometimes...
I can't see where that is. Is it near the... Oh, I see. Okay. I see it now. Okay. I've limited the bandwidth. Let's see if that helps a little bit.
Perfect.
Is the audio any better now?
Yes, that's great.
Oh, super. Thanks for that. So playtesting is the most commonly known method. It's getting real players in front of your game. This is something, what it looks like. This is an example of our single-player playtests. So this is someone playing the game. In this case, it's one of our players just demonstrating it. This is the game in question, and we are streaming this live to a different location. Sometimes it's the next room where our players are observing, or our researchers are observing. In some cases, it's around the world to where the client is. In this case, you can see things like we're doing eye tracking. We don't often do that, but we sometimes do it. And this bar along the bottom is measuring galvanic skin response. Again, we don't often do that. We don't even recommend it that much, to be honest. But it was just a demo we were setting up. So if it's a single-player game, this is us observing the player's behavior. And generally speaking, we're much more interested in players' behavior than what players say, because it's much more accurate, it's more robust. You know for a fact if players did something, well, they did it. You can't argue with it. But if a player fills out a questionnaire or tells you something, well, it's maybe reliable, who knows, maybe not, you don't know. So we're much more interested in players' behavior, especially during the early parts of testing game design. And then we interview players based on their behavior, because we watched them do it, we know they did it, and now during the interview we will explore things like, well, why did they do it? Towards the end of game development, we still may do play testing, but what we will do is a large play test. So this room you can see, for example, there's 12 players in the room at once. They each have individual booths with headphones on. We're asking a very different style of question here. We're exploring a different part of the game design. What we're really testing is the difficulty balancing, or players reaction to art style or certain features. So the previous playtest was based around more objective things, such as players' behavior or usability. This sort of playtest, where we bring in 12 players at a time, is based around subjective issues. What do you think about the fun, about the difficulty balance? What about the art style? What about this feature? There's no right or wrong answer, and the only way we can answer it reliably is through large numbers. So in one day, for example, we will get through 36 players. So 12 players come in, they play for about 1 hour, we interview them or do a questionnaire. Those 12 players leave, we then bring in a fresh 12 players, they play for an hour and a half, they leave, at the end of the day, we bring in a final 12 players. So again, on the surface, this looks like playtesting and they're both the same, but they answer different questions for the designer. This playtest is subjective questions around fun and difficulty balancing, our art style, things like that. The previous playtest is around usability issues. Can the player create an account? Are they using the weapons the way the designer wants them to? Just to give you an example of our reports, this is one page from an upcoming game called Heat Signature, and the designer has very kindly allowed us to share this report. If anyone would like a copy of the full report from our playtest, if you email me afterwards, my address is at the end, I will send a copy to you. So this is an example of our playtest reports. You can see, for example, we tell the designers what they're doing well. And you may think this is just us being nice, but that's not the case. It's just as important to point out what works well than what doesn't work, which is the issue below this. Because sometimes designers put in a feature by pure chance that is the best way of doing it, but they didn't know that. So we have to tell the designer, that is really good. Make sure you do this. These are the principles of why that is good. But the one beneath it, that is not good. This is a high priority issue. Many players will leave your game because of this issue. Here's a description, here's why they will leave the game, and here's what you do about it. Here's a suggestion. So we need both. I know we're running out of time, so I'm going to skip to the end if that's okay. We're near the end anyway. So the overall principle is, as a game designer and a user researcher, we have 10 different methods, at least, in the user research toolbox that can polish the gameplay. And you can see that each of these methods adds a little bit of polish to one or more of the 4 layers. So the yellow methods add polish to these yellow dots. The design phase adds polish down here. The production phase, the blue dots, adds polish to these all 4 layers. And then in soft launch, where analytics comes in, for example, it also adds polish to all 4 layers. So we often see in the game industry that they say, oh, it's only playtesting that we can do. It's definitely not true. You have at least 10 methods. We've got a few more as well that can really help you. And it's not just us saying this. Supercell say the same thing. Only when they see the good figures for engagement and retention do they launch their game worldwide. Only then do they do user acquisition. And both Google and Apple have been on the record saying, here's how we get games featured. We're looking for games that are high engagement figures, high retention. And that's both from algorithms and from the curators. They both say the same thing. You will only get featured if these metrics are good. Phew, okay, there's 10 minutes per question. Sorry that took so long. And thanks for keeping with me for the issues as well. I guess Melissa will share this deck with you. We're happy to do that. And if you want a copy of those reports, either our playtest report or the interaction analysis, the controls report, if you email me, I will send you a copy of those.
It would be great if we have links to those, if they're public, or if I could also distribute those with the deck, that would be really wonderful. And then there was also someone who was asking for the name of your book.
There's no name. It's a separate report that's for sale. The Base Builder report is a report that we sell, so it's a separate thing again. But
and that's the 255-page.
Yeah.
Okay.
It took us a year. I can send a sample of it. I will try and include a link for the sample for people to download as well.
Great.
I'm trying to get back to Hangouts. Bear with me, Melissa. I'm trying to turn off screen sharing. So.
Yep, if you should be able to click the green screen share there.
Yeah, I tried that and it brought up a really weird message. Am I back? Can you see me?
Yes, you're back.
Okay, we're back. I'll leave it there. I'll not touch anything. We're fine. Um, so if
Well,
anyone is, yeah, go on.
yeah, I was just going to say thank you so much for joining us and preparing this talk. Breaking it down into such a structured approach is really, really helpful. And I remember when you and I were chatting about how we can help some of the startups in the community, and you just said, bring them all to me, and I'll help. Don't worry,
We'll
I'll
do our
take care of
best.
it. But to share some of these insights with us is really, really valuable. I know that we have a couple of folks who have asked some questions, and we were asking them via chat, but if you guys are comfortable and have audio capacity, go ahead and unmute now. Ishay, I don't know if you had one, or Mitch, if you wanted to unmute and ask your questions.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, I
Yes.
can.
Okay, so first off, thank you very much, and it was very interesting, and I stayed through the hiccups. Very
Thank you.
interesting. And what interests me is that, and I've asked it, you know, for every game, you've answered it a bit, but for every game, you need to develop almost a new mechanism. It's not
Yep.
like standard UI that we have when we develop an application or things like this. And to really have it in your hand, to really touch it, and there are so many Androids and there are so many devices. So how can you give an accurate estimation or an estimation for the learning curve of the functionality?
So there's another method again for assessing learning curve. I didn't even get to talk about that. So if you're assessing learning curve over a period of time, for example, weeks or months, the way we fix that or address that is an engagement diary, so a diary study. And one of the examples I was going to show is we sometimes track people over a week or 2 weeks or a month, and every time they play our game or the client's game, they have to fill out a digital diary. It's a Google Sheet, actually. So we pre-populate it with questions, and they fill that in every single time they play. So we can see how their curve is over time. For example, day 3, they're using these features, or day 5, they're reporting difficulty, because it's qualitative as well. So
Is
that's...
there,
No, carry on, please.
sorry, being Israeli a bit here. Is there like a method to see, because let's say when I play games, sometimes I would, you know, I would press something by mistake, and it would frustrate me a lot.
Mm-hmm.
Or like rapidly shooting in a game, meaning, or, you know, on an iPhone or on a mobile phone, meaning that you really have to rapid click on it and things like this. So, and it creates frustration. How can you avoid it beforehand?
I'm not quite sure the question, really. So if it comes to novel interactions, so we do have clients who are designing things that you've never seen before. And you're right that each one of our clients, we work on 50, 60 games a year. They all have something new and unique. So we normally start with a prototype. So before the full game is built, whatever is new and risky with that game, so whatever part of the game nobody has seen before, and in a lot of cases this is control schemes, they give us a build of that game, and we play test that feature on its own, pretty much. So we're play testing only with the unique feature. And these prototypes are often very quick to build. I mean, days to build. There's no artwork. There's nothing else around the game. There's no metagame. Yep, just the mechanic. So a lot of our clients are building the game inside out. They start with the mechanic that's new. They prove that is fun and interesting and that it works. And then they layer up the game until you got things like the metagame, the artwork, you know. They do not build a game top down. That's quite rare, I would say.
Okay. Well, thanks. I'll give the stage. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
And I believe we had one more question.
So, if you guys don't mind, I've got a question. Hey, Mitch, I'm a designer on some of Google's enterprise applications. And what I found really interesting was that you differentiated between usability and gameplay-related heuristics. And so, assuming that usability heuristics are a given, are there any of the gameplay-related heuristics that we should think about incorporating into our own UX assessment whenever we do assessments of our applications?
Oh, interesting question. You know, we're sometimes contacted by application companies, so non-gaming companies, asking for that very thing, which is which heuristics around fun or enjoyment or stickiness should we incorporate into our app? And it's hard to say. There's no one catch-all question because the purpose of a game is very different than the purpose of an app. You know, as you know. So it's difficult to say. What I would say is, how do you want someone to feel when using your app? You know, why should they come back? But it's so hard to say. I think you've asked a killer question in one go, which there's no short answer. There's no short. Even for video games, it's different because if we ask players of one game why they come back for more, why do they keep coming back, you will get different answers. I was saying earlier, there's different types of fun. So I can't answer your question in one. You know, make sure you include this heuristic for fun because it's really important. I don't know. I'm happy to think about it though. I'll think about it some more.
Okay, cool.
But it's not easy. It's not an easy question. Yeah.
Cool. Okay, thank you.
Excellent. Well, we've got a couple questions from chat. Etienne, did you want to ask those live, or do you want me to read those?
Oh, you mean me, Melissa, or?
Oh, microphone's dead. Okay, perfect. So the questions were, any key books that you recommended for a deeper dive on the subject, aside from the full research that you created, which I believe that a couple people are going to be purchasing anyway, and any interesting new trends to watch out for in mobile gaming in the last few months?
Trends, yes.
And you have 2 minutes to answer those two.
To solve the gaming industry. Trends, one thing that's come up a lot recently, I mentioned it earlier, is designing your game for YouTube and Twitch. That is becoming heavily important because you want players to talk about your game. And I was saying the number 1 problem is discoverability. So I write for a website called Games Industry. My next article is on virality. How do you design your game to be viral? And there are some cases of designers who have done this. Most people think it's chance, and that definitely has happened. But some designers are designing for it as well. So think about the social features. Why would people watch your game? Why would they talk about it? Could it become an esport like Rocket League? Some games didn't even design to become an esport, but they are. Hearthstone, you know, Rocket League, as I'm saying. All these things are becoming trends. So the Twitch thing, esports, how to design for virality, those are themes that are being talked about a lot. And I think user research or UX research has a heavy factor in all those things as well. It's about understanding people, right? It never goes away. So
that's what we're all trying to do, I think,
exactly.
at the end of the day.
Any other very... Oh, sorry, go on.
I was going to just ask in the final moment if you had any recommended reading or any books that you've recently read that really struck home.
There aren't that many books. There's one called Game Usability. It's got a white cover. It's quite academic in nature. So I'm writing a chapter for a new book coming out. If you can hold back a few months, Oxford University Press will be gathering together an enormous book on game user research, which should be out later this year. There's another book called Games User Experience, I believe, by Springer. I think I've got a chapter in there somewhere as well. Again, it's more of an academic focus. It's not for practitioners. For practitioners, I recommend Gamma Sutra. There is many websites, articles talking about game usability. I also recommend a LinkedIn group called Games User Research. It's called GURSIG. So Games User Research Special Interest Group. If you look on there, you can join. That is all usability people worldwide in games, sharing as much as they can. And there's also a website called Games User Research as well. Is that the right name? I can maybe put a link to it. And I think they put links in as well for interesting articles and things like that. Yeah. I'll try and do a brain dump at some point of as many resources as I can.
Excellent. Well, we'll look out for the upcoming virality blog post because I think there's going to be a lot of interest. How do we not pay for user acquisition?
Yeah.
And thank you so much again for sharing those insights. I've taken massive notes in our community note doc, and I'll try to consolidate that into something more digestible, and we'll share that out with the rest. And this was recorded, so for anyone who missed it, we'll be able to share that around, and feel free to pass this link to anybody who would be interested.
Yeah, I'm happy to share as much as we can. So any links, any book recommendations, if you drop me an email, I'll try and share as much as I can.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you, Melissa, for inviting me.
Bye.
Bye-bye.